today's topic is beyond difference. How do we find a way to love and appreciate one another, even in the face of irreconcilable differences? So it should be an interesting conversation. But before we get started, let's take a minute to get present and let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen just flooding your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing and revitalizing every cell, every organ. And as we exhale, exhale any fatigue, stress, tension, negativity. And now let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And this time, imagine brilliant bright light lighting you up from the inside out, illuminating, electrifying, energizing, and connecting you with the world beyond as you exhale. Exhale any remaining fatigue, tension, stress, negativity. And now let's just gently press our palms together, really softly tune into your fingertips and all the little nerve endings in your palms and feel how delicious the sensation is, and bring yourself present right here, right now. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Good morning. Good morning, Rosalind. Wonderful to be here with you and everybody else who's joining us. We're talking about beyond differences. So it's this came up for me yesterday in a situation with a very, very dear friend whom I adore and whom I often butt heads with. We have different, very strong and different ideas about certain things, although our baseline value structure is very, very much the same. And we encountered an issue that was absolutely irreconcilable for me in that I had a position that I was and am unwilling to waver from. It's like when you know you need to do something that is right for you, regardless of someone else's opinion, regardless of someone else's influence. There are times when we know what we know, and we know what is the proper course of action or the appropriate course of action. And despite disagreement and even pressure potentially from other loved ones, what we can do is agree to disagree. Excellent, Rosalind, exactly. And in this case, it was about making a decision that affected both of us as well as other people. And it was, my position was that my criteria needed to be met, or I wouldn't engage in the venture. And it was a really, really interesting conversation and dynamic, because the other person wanted the outcome they wanted as much as I was insistent upon the outcome that I wanted, and our outcomes were different. So it was either I was really solid in knowing that it had to be the way that I was, that the situation had to meet my criteria, and that was non-negotiable. And so when we reach places in life that are non-negotiable, I don't think it happens necessarily that often, but there are times when we come to these places that are non-negotiable, and we get to decide what is important. Do we cave, or do we bend, or I think what the conversation here is when is it that if we bend we break, and how do we come to a place to agree to disagree and to not personalize things to the point where we lose our relationship with one another. Good morning, Irma. Welcome, welcome. It's great to have you here as always. So we're talking about transcending difference, moving beyond our differences with one another. So in this case, the disagreement was not personal. Good morning, Andrea. Welcome, welcome. Great to have you. Um, so what we're talking about is navigating differences. How do we go beyond our differences, even if they are irreconcilable? There are times when we just completely disagree. And when we completely disagree about something that we are personally passionate about, sometimes we lose sight of a path to maintaining our love, appreciation, and respect for the other person. And we see this, we've seen so much of this past year with political polarization and ideological polarization, and I've known people to say, oh, well, if that's what you believe, we're no longer friends. And it's a challenge. It's a challenging place to be. What is it that allows us to transcend our differences and agree to disagree? So I'm thinking, if we think about it, what it comes down to is values, how much we value that other person in our lives, how much we value um, that the relationship that we have beyond being right, or being identified with our ideas. So Rosalind says non-negotiable is keeping true to self-values. When something doesn't sit right with you, there's always a choice. Beautifully said, Rosalind. I agree. So this was completely non-negotiable, and it was really interesting to notice some of the interaction where my friend was saying to me that I was being emotional and they were being rational. And I said, no, that's not the case at all. This is just the way it is. It's non-negotiable. If you want my participation, this particular thing has to meet this criteria. And I was really, really clear on that. And because I knew my own direction, I didn't have to make up stories about them. Like I didn't have to make them bad or wrong. I could just say, I totally got what they were talking about and why they wanted what they wanted, but it wasn't going to happen. And, it's kind of like, it made me think of parenting. Now, I'm not a parent. I have no children other than feathered and furry friends and kids. But there are times when no is no, and it is not negotiable, and there is no amount of reasoning that is going to shift the no. And the thing is that in so many cases, we make these circumstances personal. And what was really beautiful in this interaction, and we could say, disagreement, passionate disagreement, was that we were both very present to the fact that we love one another. We thought, well, maybe we were siblings, with sibling rivalry in another lifetime or something, where there was all this disagreement about things. But it's interesting when we think about like-mindedness. I think that many of us can agree that sustainability is a really important, essential focus for our future. And yet, when we look at the intricacies of what that looks like, how we might implement it, getting down to the nitty-gritty of details, we might have vast disagreement or extreme disagreement. And sometimes there is no compromise. And so Andrea says, setting your own boundaries. Exactly. Exactly. So when we have our boundaries, how do we transcend our boundaries to be able to connect with one another or maintain a connection despite passionate disagreement? I'm reminded of a poem that I wrote as a kid, and it was about a castle and how I was protected in this castle that was surrounded by a moat and a drawbridge, so the drawbridge was up and I was protected. But the thing is, I couldn't get out. And sometimes when we draw our boundaries, we end up being a prisoner within them. And knowing when it's okay to bend and knowing when certain things are non-negotiable it's an inside job. And the thing is that somebody trying to convince us otherwise may be using all kinds of tactics to to get their objective, right? To meet their objective. And then we can choose to recognize that that's how somebody is trying to get what they want, to kind of breach the boundaries. But we also get to know that those boundaries are context specific, and we don't necessarily have to generalize them to a place where we end our interaction. And sometimes it's appropriate to end the interaction. Sometimes it's appropriate to say, you know what, um, we just need to go our separate ways. Sometimes that's what happens too. But I'm wondering, when we agree to disagree, what are we actually doing? What's the dynamic of that? I think that what we're doing is we're accepting our own autonomy, and we're respecting the autonomy of the other person. And maybe we're doing an internal calculation to say, are there more benefits than deficits here? I don't know if that's entirely true. It's like, where do you where do you step back? Where do you stop playing? uh, where do we stop engaging with other people and with life, etc., when we come to a place of disagreement? um, I'm wondering, what is the mechanism of staying present to our love for another person at the same time that we passionately disagree? you know and all the things that are tied up with that, tied up with identity and being right, and knowing our own limits, respecting our own limits. Where do we how do we navigate this very interesting territory? It's actually pretty complex, and yet we often do it with great clarity, or um, great intention. Like, there was nothing that was going to change my mind about this. And compassion and humbleness, Irma says. Yeah, yeah, I think that by knowing your boundaries, it is possible to not have to be defending them viciously. And I want to say hi to Dennis. Welcome. It's great to have you here. Um, and so let me just reiterate that by knowing our boundaries, we don't have to defend them viciously. We can just say, this is the boundary. And I said that multiple times, and then there was all this, you know, attempt to convince me otherwise. And I said, I'm not going to change my mind. This is how it is. It's non-negotiable. And because it was non-negotiable, I, I didn't have I didn't have to try and convince them otherwise, which put me in a position to not have to be defensive. And so, like, when you know what you know, when you're clear in yourself, when you're certain of your boundaries, then there's a power in that enables the solidity of that stance without the resistance that we each encounter when we're uncertain. So one of the things that I notice is that when I feel a certain way, but I don't have absolute certainty or confidence in my choice or my position, that then there's all kinds of resistance and upset because I'm uncertain, because I'm not clear 100% on my boundaries, or if it's right, or if it's okay, or if I deserve to have that boundary. And when that occurs, then there's all this resistance in myself that then shows in my communication with others. I don't know if you notice this. So, Irma says, I'm sorry, Irma says acceptance of what it is for both. Exactly. And and Irma says accepting is not agreeing. That's true. That's true. They are not one and the same. I can accept that you have a different vantage point without agreeing with your vantage point. And there, there are certain places where we are not open to other points of view. And we don't necessarily have an obligation to be. We don't have an obligation to be open to other points of view. However, meaning, like, if we've made a determination, like, this is my non-negotiable place, then then we don't have an obligation to to continue to entertain other options. When things are black and white, and there are times when things are black and white. It's not necessarily that often. So when things are gray, shades of gray, then we have the opportunity potentially to be negotiating and considering different vantage points and opinions. But there are times when no is no, when black and white are the only options. And so when we meet those points, that's a decision point. And then based on that decision point, then after that decision point, there's perhaps room for negotiation. And what happens, I think, is oftentimes we're not really clear on our no. And when we're not really clear on our no, then when we're not clear on our no, what happens is that we waffle and we fight with ourselves. And in fighting with ourselves, there's an emotional dissonance within us that then gets projected outward. So Rosalind says, bending or compromising your values to the point where it affects your self-worthiness and safety is essentially a thought process of how much of your values you're willing to sacrifice. So I guess one can be more certain what those boundaries are when the values correlate to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The higher up the hierarchy, the less tangible those values can be, less certain. Interesting concept, Rosalind. I I I don't know if like ultimately our values are not necessarily rational. And this was an interesting thing in the conversation because there were a couple points. This person's an engineer, so there were a couple points in the conversation where rationality came up. Good morning, Isabel. Great to have you here. Where rationality came up and mathematically calculated sort of equivalencies and the notion of false equivalencies and equating this with that when it doesn't really equate. And it was really interesting in that regard. But when we talk about values, values are not rational. You know, the things like one of my highest values is beauty. How do you equate beauty with rationality? It's not. It's experiential. And the thing about rationality is that, and we've elevated it to some kind of deity in our culture. Rationality does not necessarily take in the entire picture. For instance, even environmentally, rationally, we could say, okay, well, I can compensate, I can do all this environmental damage, and I can compensate for it by planting more trees. But the thing is that there are certain aspects of that damage that planting trees isn't going to heal. For example, that the rational mathematical approach isn't going to. It's certainly not going to hurt things, and it might improve things, but it's not going to resolve the entire issue, for example. And when we talk about looking at a rational solution for something, what's happening is we're trying to denature it, like in a literal way, to take nature out of it, to take life out of it and reduce it to a calculation. And so I don't believe that values are rational. They are intrinsic, they are experiential, they are holistic, they are soulful. And like beauty isn't something I decided was one of the most important things to me. It just is. It just is. And that and how do you describe beauty rationally, right? So when we talk about the hierarchy of needs, I'm not so sure about the hierarchy of needs. I'm not so sure about its accuracy, because I think fundamentally as human beings, when we have a spiritual foundation, which is up in the higher part of the hierarchy of needs, we are able to navigate circumstance much more fully and effectively. So in certain respects, I'm inclined to believe that the hierarchy of needs maybe needs to be turned upside down. You know, certainly we understand that food and shelter are critically important, but I can say that I have seen people in squalor who have a very different experience of the bounty of life than people living wealthy and privileged. You know, like a different experience of the actual richness and a deeper appreciation and gratitude for life than people who are privileged and are consumed by wanting more. So Rosalind says, where would beauty fall on the spectrum of hierarchy of needs? For me, it's fundamental. I don't know where beauty would fall. And again, I I I'm not convinced that the hierarchy of needs is accurate anymore. If it ever was, I mean, I get it, I understand it, but the thing is that I know that people have more latitude to consider spirituality and connection when they have their food and shelter taken care of, but there are all kinds of peoples who are suffering for need and want of food and shelter, who have this deep connection with the spirituality, the dimension of spirituality of the universe. And that's like at the top of the hierarchy of needs. I kind of think that that's fundamental. Having a connection to the universe allows us to navigate the craziness of it. But that's just me. Like that's my hypothesis. I'm not saying like that's right. I'm just saying that that's kind of the vantage point that I take. So I question that. It's I think that love helps us get through the challenges of our subsistence needs. Yes, we need food and shelter, and that's the rational approach. However, when everything is falling apart, what do we rely on? We rely on our faith, right? So I think, again, getting back to the values idea. Um, so Rosalind, you're saying, so I guess one can be more certain what those boundaries are when the values correlate to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And again, the higher up the hierarchy, the less tangible those values can be, the less certain. I don't know. Sometimes I think that the least tangible things are the things that we have most certainty of. Like creativity and beauty, freedom. Those things for me, those are the most important things. And what that means, maybe to your point, Rosalind, maybe because they are more abstract, there's more flexibility in the interpretation. um, yeah, I'm not really certain. I'm not certain, but anyway, I do have a 9:30 appointment, so I am going to say thank you, thank you, thank you for engaging with me in this, and looking at how we can transcend difference to still love one another despite completely opposing perspectives on certain things. And I just love spending this time with you. Deeply, deeply appreciate you. I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection. And Maggie and I, here's Maggie, go live each weekday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern. Please check out the other awesome programming on Enlightened World Network. And until next time, so much love and deep appreciation for you. I'm having trouble figuring out how to get to Zoom here to be able to close it out. Here we go. All right, everybody. Lots of love.